All right, this video is going to be all about using triggers, which is really a key element in level design and game development. So I'll add this video under the using triggers heading here as soon as it's done, but I wanted to direct your attention to the project requirements, and you can see there's a number of things that involve triggers, like we want a triggered particle effect. Pretty sure I asked for a triggered sound effect. So a trigger is essentially an invisible region or volume that keeps track of when the player touches it or when something touches it. And so when something enters the trigger, uh, we can make different things happen. So here's my trigger example in the sample scene, and you can see its collider is this cube volume here. And so when the player enters into this, something's going to happen. And right now, if you find the generic trigger script, you can see that it has a couple elements. One is if you only want the thing to trigger once, you can check that. If you leave that unchecked, it will do whatever you have it set up to do every single time the player enters it. If you have it checked, it'll only trigger once. And right now, my trigger in the example scene is set up to play a sound effect. So the way I set that up is I made an empty game object called triggered sound test. So right click, create empty. That's how you make an empty game object. And then I added an audio source component to that game object. So I hit add component, and you start typing audio source, and you will see it in the list. And so that's what I did. That's how I got this audio source. And then you can go find any sound clip that you want. I recommend the website freesound.org. Lots of free stuff there. Anything you grab, just make sure that you have permission to use, royalty free, and keep track of the link to it so you can add it to your credits. And so here's the audio clip. I made a little folder for audio, and I dragged that wave file into my audio folder just to keep it organized. And in my audio source on my empty game object here, I plugged in the sound effect that I want it to play. And it's important that you remember to uncheck play on awake, because by default an audio source will just start playing right away. So if you wanted this to be background music, you could leave play on awake on and leave loop on, and it'll just keep playing forever as soon as you start the level. But we want this to play when the player triggers it. So we're going to uncheck play on awake. We're going to uncheck loop because I don't want it to keep going forever. But in some cases, maybe that makes sense, something you want to add. And keep, you can adjust volume here too, something I keep in mind. And so the next step to getting this all to play when the player goes into the trigger, if we take a look at our trigger object again, down here on its generic trigger component, you can see there's this little area where you can add things to the on trigger entered event. So if you hit the plus button, you would get an empty one, or maybe I guess it's not empty. If it's empty, it would look like this, and you would have to drag something into it. So I dragged the empty game object with the audio source that I put on there. So this thing, but it could be anything you want to trigger, you could drag in here. And then this drop down is going to show you the different components on that game object. So the one that I added is audio source, and you can see there's an audio source play function. And if you do that, when the player goes into the trigger, this is what will happen. Now, I don't want to do it twice, so I'll disable that. But let's say you wanted to play an animation, or you wanted to play a particle effect. You could just so if I had an object that was animating with an animator component, which, how to create animations is it's out of scope for this tutorial, so you should just look it up. But if you had an animator on something, and I just called this animation test, and I went to my trigger and I made a new little slot to do something, and I dragged the animation test in, and I click on the drop down, you'll see the animator component is on there, and animator also has a play function there. So you could play the animator. Maybe you actually wanted, I don't know, it just depends. If you wanted to play a certain specific clip, you can enter the name of the clip, I guess, is how that would work. You can do it with a timeline animation if you know how to set up a timeline, or you can also do it with a particle system. So if I were to get rid of my animator and add like a particle system, I don't know where this thing is. Yeah, you can see it's emitting particles over there. If I were to again disable play on awake, because that's something that the particle effects do also. So I disabled play on awake. I'm gonna go back to my trigger trigger example, and I'm gonna drag in my particle test, and I'll find the particle system component, and there is a play function. And so somehow I didn't click it. Oh, that's interesting. I don't know why it says no function, even though it also says play, which is kind of strange. I don't know if that's a bug or what. Let's see what happens. If I hit play, in theory, that particle system will not be playing because the player hasn't entered the trigger. And I'm going to steer my guy to the trigger, and it did start the particle effect. So I think that was just like a little bug with the editor not showing what I actually clicked here, which I don't know why. It's kind of weird. Let's see if it fixed itself. Yeah, it did fix itself after I hit play. So anyway, you can do lots, one trigger can do lots of things, not just one. So you could keep adding things if you wanted. Let's say I wanted to make this thing not rotate. So this is my rotating object. If I were to disable that script and hit play, you will see that it won't be spinning around this time. And it will start spinning around as soon as I turn that script back on, right? On, off. So I just need a way to check that box in my trigger. So I can do that by going back to my trigger example and making another spot here for the rotating object. I'll drag that in. And so the rotating object has this rotate script, and I want to control its bool enabled setting, which the enabled setting is just the same as these check boxes that are on all of your components. So that's enabled, that's disabled. So you can see if the renderer is disabled, you can't see it. And if the renderer is enabled, you can see it. It's hard to see because it's this transparent thing here. You can see it better like that, right? So enabling any component turns it on, and disabling it turns it off. So if I uncheck rotate dot enabled, it will be the same as going on to that object and unchecking the rotate script. And if I instead in my trigger tell it that I want it, when the player goes into this trigger, I want to check that rotate dot enabled checkbox, that would be the same as checking it here. So in theory, when the player drives into the trigger, it will start spinning, and we can test that. So I'm going to go up here, I'm going to go into it, and you can see in my scene view that it is spinning now. So very powerful. If you wanted to turn a whole game object off, you can do that too. So if I go into my trigger and I want to say, I don't know, make the whole goal turn on. Maybe you want to start the level with no goal and the player has to do something, and then it turns the goal on. So I could go into my trigger, which, by the way, you can add new triggers real easily if that's not clear. You just go into your prefabs and you just drag a new trigger in. And so there it is. And so you can control its like how much space the trigger takes up by going to its collider. And I thought I would find like an edit collider thing. I guess this is a Pro Builder mesh. So maybe what I would do is use this like, you can either use the Pro Builder tools, which I don't have on, or you could use the rectangle tool, and you can change how big this is to make sure it fits your level layout just right, you know. But I will make this trigger turn on the goal. So inside of this trigger, I can add a spot to do something. I'm going to throw the goal in here, and I'm going to find the game object choice, and we're going to find the game object set active. So all these little components, checking them is called enabling and disabling. But if you want to turn an entire game object on and off, that's called active and deactivated. So this is set active false. This is set active true. So if you want to make stuff disappear or turn on and off, you can use set active. So back on my second trigger I added here, I have set active, and let's say I want it to turn on, I would check that. So in order to see that doing something, I guess I'd have to start my trigger or my goal turned off. And then let's run my game. I actually can't really see this trigger right now, so we need to make sure we put it somewhere that's easy to see. I guess I'll put it here right before where the goal is. So I'll turn the game on, and I'll start piloting the character towards that little trigger region. And when I entered it, you could see the goal turned on. And then when I touched the goal, it brought up this victory thing. All right, that's probably about it for the trigger video. Hopefully that makes sense.